So welcome to our webinar on polarization across people, groups, and organizing. I'm Laura Rees, the chair-elect of the Conflict Management Division of Academy of Management, and Shah, who is the past chair, and I will be moderating today's panel because it's just such an interesting and relevant and timely topic. It's a persistent influence on how we relate to one another, how perceived divisions are created and unfold, how we function in organizations and in society more broadly. So we're very much looking forward to a lively discussion with our panelists who are all experts on, are you ready? Perception, conflict, fault lines, trust, fairness, justice, cooperation, and relationships in organizations and organizing. And that's not even the full list, but just a few. So we're very thrilled to welcome Cecily Cooper from the University of Miami, Audrey Korsgaard from the University of South Carolina, J.P. Stevens from Case Western Reserve University, and Sherry Thatcher from the University of Tennessee-Knoxville. So on behalf of our co-sponsors, the Academy of Management Conflict Management Division and the International Association for Conflict Management, welcome to the session, and thanks so much for being here.
For having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
I want to ask what I think is a very simple question, but I suspect will be quite complicated. So let's just jump right in. What is polarization, and how does your work relate to polarization and vice versa? So JP, putting you on the spot, let's start with you.
I know. We're prepared for this. Well, good day, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And, I should have a really snappy answer to this, right? But who knows where we are with as academics. We dig into the weeds here as we should, as we probably need to with these big social issues. I'll just say for me, when I think of polarization, I think of like magnetic poles, which repulse each other, right? So there's something, at least this is more maybe viscerally and personally, but also academically. I think it's not just division and fragmentation in organizations and societies per se, but the fact that these differences, right, they can produce fault lines, which I know Sherry's studied extensively. But there's something about when these fault lines and breaks and fragments lend themselves to repulsion, right? This sort of very extreme sort of outgroup discrimination. And I think you see, and I've been Googling polarization just for fun. And there's something about those extremes that people go into. How does my work relate to that? I I think I studied the opposite polarization. I study positive work relationships and more specifically the particularly interpersonal, emotional, and communication dynamics in those work relationships. I've also been looking at, in the past few years, interorganizational relationship dynamics on large construction projects, which of course, there's all these layers to it about the individuals and then their disciplinary backgrounds and functional backgrounds. I've also looked at heedful interrelating. So a set of, what are the microdynamics involved when individuals are striving to perform as a collective? So the link to polarization, in my mind at least, is I really care about the sensitivity that individuals have to themselves and the elements of the system that they're a part of, right? So my awareness of my own emotional state, my own behaviors relative to yours, helps me understand if we're drifting apart or moving in sync, right? So I think human beings are exquisitely sensitive to that moving apart and being in sync. And then there's also knowledge of the bigger system, which tends to be more abstract, more sort of felt kind of tacit knowledge. So I've looked at that through aesthetic experience. And I think that knowledge of, something bigger than ourselves that we're contributing to helps orient us and reorient us when we start to drift apart. So on my end, very much personally interested in these sort of microdynamics, individual and interpersonal, but then how do they speak to some larger, maybe more meso and macro dynamics? Yep, so that's me.
Hey, well, I was told I'm up next. So I think, it's interesting because polarization now has become such a huge topic. And in some ways, the study of fault lines, which I've studied for a very long time, is actually polarization, but I had never thought about it that way until fairly recently. And so I think of polarization basically as division into groups that hold similar views. And, as mentioned, it's related to fault lines, which are more specifically in terms of how individuals with attribute similarity across multiple dimensions might separate into separate groups. And that separation, although maybe not kind of as divisive or hostile as JP had described, still experience issues because they're coming from different perspectives, and they seem to hold similar perspectives within group, but different perspectives across groups. So I guess, yeah, that's kind of where I've explored the idea of polarization. So I'll pass it off to Cecily.
Thanks, Sherry. So when I was preparing for this, my research stream that I've been developing is specifically on ideological polarization. And so polarization in terms of political ideology. And there are different ways that the literature discusses polarization. And so one is structural polarization. So that's the actual societal polarization. And there's two aspects to that. One is society is fairly evenly divided, say in terms of liberal versus conservative leanings. So there's a fairly even division. And then you have people falling more towards the extremes. And so if this was in a figure, picture a two-humped camel, right? And then the humps start getting further apart. And that's how you think about societal polarization. Now, what happens, and we're organizational scholars, is that societal polarization can then spill over and impact perceived polarization. And that's what caught my interest, is how perceived polarization impacts the work environment. And so I have 4 projects that are based on this idea that societal polarization has really impacted and changed the playing field in the workplace. And it's changing how people interact and the information that they use to establish and maintain relationships. And so what's happening again, societal polarization is affecting perceived polarization at work. So one of my projects is with Audrey, so I'm going to wait and let her discuss that. With the other 3 projects, I have a qualitative project that's around issues such as why people decide to conceal versus reveal their ideology at work. Also, why do people discuss politics at work in the first place, despite these old adages that you shouldn't discuss politics or religion at work? And also, when these political discussions do occur, how do people kind of mitigate any negative consequences, or can they? All right. And then I have a survey study where I collected data around both the 2020 and 2024 elections, pre and post survey data that examines, generally speaking, political discourse and implications in terms of stress-based responses like rumination, insomnia, and counterproductive work behaviors, and the conditions under which these stress responses are activated. And then the final project is we collected network data in a couple of organizations that are in the same industry, and it's trying to pinpoint specifically, because it's network data, like if I'm going to talk about politics at work, who do I choose to talk about politics with? Right. And I'm a trust scholar, and I think, I think the data is going to play that. We've started looking at the data a little bit, that this is an interesting outcome of trust, right? Because we choose to talk about politics to people who we already trust, but we're also making a lot of assumptions about those people, and that we already know what their ideology is. And those assumptions are often wrong. And so I can't wait to kind of get into that a little bit more. And now I'll pass it off to, I guess it's Audrey.
So surprisingly, my definition of polarization is very similar to Cecily's, since we're collaborating. Yeah, I'm interested in political polarization or ideological polarization as well. And so there's the actual, in terms of statistically what appears to be the case. So we've seen actually the center getting bigger in terms of where people register. So there's more people registering as independent, or we're not registering with either party. But we're also seeing the ones that in the parties have over the last like 30 years, their views have gotten more conservative. They're by their own identity. They identify as being more conservative, being more liberal. And that independent group actually identifies more with being conservative or liberal. So we are seeing this migration and sort of kind of thing that I think Sherry's interested in. I'm not particularly interested in how we got there, but this migration. So this phenomenon of polarization appears to be, on a structural level, appears to be increasing in at least in the United States. And then there's the perceptual side of it, which is when people see that occurring. That's one of the things I find really interesting, I think is a really important topic for future research, is how does that differ depending on where you put yourself on that spectrum? So you could be a centrist and think that that person's really polarizing, although you're not at a pole, so how can that person be polarizing? But I think that happens a lot. And then there are people who are on a pole, and they could hear something that's centrist and say, oh, that person's really polarizing. So it's the perception, I think, goes very differently than the actual continua of ideology. So we're interested largely as a psychologist in the perceptual part of the process. So the project that Cecily and I are doing is a conceptual piece looking at this through the lens of trust. I feel like trust is a linchpin for so much of everything. If that judgment occurs, and then downstream from that, you see a lot of outcomes that all of us are interested in around conflict and broadly organizational behavior. So to me, it's a really useful linchpin. This context is so different because most of the trust research, when it comes to interpersonal relationships, is about your experience with that individual in ways that are meaningful for you, right? So you're at work, this domain of trust in the workplace, you delegate to a coworker, they do a lousy job, you don't trust them as much. You collaborate with a coworker, they take credit for all the work, and you don't trust them that much. So there's always these things that are happening that are relevant personally to you, and they're actual events, they're actual experiences. That's not the only thing that drives it, but that's a big part of interpersonal trust in the workplace. And polarization is like just a stance, right? So there's no necessary personal consequence for me, at least in the realm of work, to know that someone has a really polarizing view. And yet we do think it affects trust. And that's what we're trying to explain, is why does that alter people's relationships, and specifically the extent to which they think that they are benevolent, they have integrity, that they're smart. And you've all heard this, right? You know, when people talk about the views of someone on the pole, and oh, they're crazy, they're stupid, they're hypocrites. You know, it touches on all those aspects of trust. So why that's happening, and we're specifically looking at disclosures. So when there is information either voluntarily or inadvertently revealing coworkers' trust, polarization, or what appears to be a polarizing view, and how that impacts the relationship via trust. So that's broadly what we're looking at, and then the sort of theoretical underpinnings of that, looking both at social identity, which has been the real major theoretical explanation for a lot of this, but also looking at moral emotions and moralization. I could explain a lot of this. So that's where we're at. And it's really interesting. At the same time, I am working with a doctoral student in education who's doing research on no confidence votes in universities. And the accumulation of research so far, which is not very good, she's going to have a big impact because research in that field is not good. But the accumulation of evidence suggests that there's a real polarization on campuses across disciplines. So this kind of gets to what you're talking about, JP, in terms of your disciplinary background affecting these views, and in my opinion on politics, it's views that are not actually work relevant, but they create a lens for how you look at your work life. So for example, there are broadly like two major reasons for no confidence votes. One is some kind of misconduct, so the board hired somebody through bias and not a legitimate procedure. And then there are ones that are really kind of existential. You're going to close a program, you're going to take away tenure or things like that. So the job of the individuals is at stake. And then there's also sometimes these social ones that kind of relate to the board or the president misconduct. And we see that it's mostly in the humanities where the activity is happening, and there's real resistance in areas of the STEM field and engineering. I'm not sure we're business schools, so I'm not sure there's much evidence of them, but there's like a resentment, like do your work, get done, stop wasting our time on these other things. That's causing dissent within the university. So I think this is revealing a very interesting thing about how the views of rights and equity, fairness are much more top of mind on these certain disciplines, and it is filtering in how they see what's going on campus and when they think they should have a voice over it, which is not, there's not a lot of consensus on this across the rest of the campus. So it's an interesting manifestation of political polarization, I believe. So that's it for me.
Okay. I want to know all the things. I told you it would not be a simple question to start us off. But I want to follow up on just a couple of points because my head is already exploding on this. So one is that several of you talked about the perceived polarization, that it's a lot of perception, and that speaks very deeply to my heart and my own research as well. And that's just so interesting that it doesn't even need to be real. What is real? I mean, what is reality? We can all ask this question. But a lot of that is that perception. And then a metaphor that came up very early is this idea of magnetic poles, because I was struck by, if I'm in the middle but see someone on the side, kind of what does that mean? Because with magnetic poles, if it's the wrong orientation, it's immediate repulsion. But all you have to do is kind of switch that a bit, and then suddenly it's actually very attractive. In a sense. And that just, I think that to me just kind of lit something in my brain that I want to think about further, but it makes me think as well. So perfect segue to our next question, kind of more broadly, what do a lot of us, I'm seeing the attendees list, are organizational scholars. What do we need to understand about polarization? And you all have different, although really related and really cool overlaps in expertise, but what would you hope that people take away from polarization research, whether that's yours or others or the field in general?
So I'll go ahead and take that. And I do want to follow on in terms of the perceptions, because one of the things we've been finding in the fault lines research is that if you look at it from individual perceptions of where there is a fault line or if there is a fault line, we see differences. So not everybody perceives a fault line that might objectively be seen to be there. And that in and of itself is different. And so what is it that causes different people to see different fault lines or different ways that groups are polarized? And so in terms of the question of what do we need to understand about polarization, I think we have this tendency, I think, to think that it's dangerous. And maybe that's the narrative that's been in society over the past few years. But I also think there's possible positives. And I don't think we've explored a lot of those yet or thought about a lot of those yet. But just if we go back to the fault lines research, we see, and it's very evident that there's conflict in teams where there are strong fault lines. And that's over and over and over and over. We see that, a meta-analysis reflects that. But we also know that within the subgroups, there can be strong cohesion, strong in-group feelings, strong positive affect around those subgroup experiences. And then also, I think if you have the right leadership to be able to allow subgroups of individuals with different views or subgroups that have different views on things to be able to communicate effectively, then you actually get some really good ideas that come about from that cross-fertilization. But you need to have those structural elements in place. And I think, I'm really interested to see Cecily's research on how societal polarization is coming into the organization, because I think organizations have a lot of mechanisms that either stamp out some of the ways that polarization might come into place, or curtail it. Like, so for example, there's rules against bullying or something, right? And so the hostility that might be evident in society may not necessarily be allowed in organizations. So I'll stop there and let someone else speak on that.
Yeah, so I think I'm second in line for this one. I would like people to, I guess, remember two things about polarization. And again, I'm discussing this in terms of ideology, political ideology specifically. First, sometimes the problems caused by polarization are imagined problems. They're not actual problems. And I'm going to give you an example. There's a really cool study that I like in Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. It was published in 2012 by Van Boven and colleagues. And it introduces this concept called polarization projection. And this is how it works. So if I'm party X and I'm very extreme in my party X views, okay? So scale of 1 to 10, I'm an 11. And I meet somebody who's party Y, then I am likely to project my degree of polarization, meaning they might be party Y, but they might be party Y on like a 2 on a scale of 1 to 10, right? It's just not, they're not that polarized. But I'm likely to assume that they're also extremely polarized. And so now I have realized that just because, so what's happening is anytime I meet somebody from a different party, because I myself am very polarized, I'm going to project and think their views are extremely opposite to mine, whereas they may not be at all. That other person might be rather middle. They just happen to vote party Y. And so now what I've done is imagined a lot more differences than there actually are between me and that person. Okay. And the second thing that I would like people to remember, and this is, Audrey and I are trying to talk about like, well, how do we solve some of these problems? And it gets really difficult because just telling people not to talk about politics at work, that's not always going to work as well. Because what my qualitative data is telling me is that a lot of times politics simply comes up in the doing of the work through necessary conversations that people are having. If you're in a healthcare organization, you're talking about how healthcare policy changes over when you have a new administration. If you build tarmacs for airports and you're a private company, but the airport funding comes from the government. And again, you're talking about policy decisions that affect your company. You can be an investment banker or something in finance, and you're choosing different investments. And a lot of these investment strategies have an ideology attached to them. And so in the doing of the work, thinking about your organization's strategic orientation or their funding or anything else, you end up talking about politics. So in a lot of ways, it can be unavoidable. And I'll pass it off to Audrey now.
So I had some other things to say, but I want to build off of what Sherry was saying and a little bit also on Cecily, and that is this idea that there are upsides to polarization, and in particular, in our case, ideological polarization. I've been saying for several years, which makes people roll their eyes, that capitalism is going to save democracy. I actually believe this. And in this case, what I think that translates into is the fact that political polarization has moved into the workplace, which, by the way, it ain't going away. In my view, one of the major drivers of that is the complete blurring of public and private lives. So you are not able to curate your image at work. It is a function of many things that are happening outside of the workplace that are making their way in. So it's there to stay, but I actually think that unlike what happens in the political sphere or in the public sphere, what happens at work is pragmatic at the end of the day. And we're all trying to achieve organizational goals, whether that's, like your mission or just trying to make money or whatever it is, and our career goals. We're trying to be really good at our jobs. And so it's very practical. And so while ideology comes into play, whether you talk about it or not, it's there, and people are ruminating over it, as Cecily's work has shown. I think what you begin to see is that common ground, that the common goal that is part of the organization, and that people can get their work done even if they are crazy hypocrites who are stupid, right? So you can still work with each other, and that pragmatic view, I think, has the potential, if we sort of leverage that, to alter people's views about what's happening outside of the organization. So there's actually an advantage to allowing people to talk about it, or allowing people to disclose who they are, or have a poster in their office that signals something, and allowing people to, civilly have conversation around it, because we get the work done. No matter what, we're going to get the work done. So again, with this ideological divide I'm seeing in higher ed, I was formerly the faculty senate chair, and I oversaw 19 committees that did various parts of curriculum, standards, and so forth. And they were really mixed on faculty from these different areas of the university, and with really different politics. And some of them very vocal, very, very infamous for their politics, but we got the work done. And the more I could bring the interdisciplinary perspective into those committees, the better they got. And so I think that is part of the value of allowing this to be present in the workplace. So the idea that there are upsides to political polarization, I think, is really interesting. The other thing, and I think this is probably true for a lot of fault lines that have invisible characteristics to it, that polarization is not necessarily ascribed, that it is chosen. So people choose beliefs and views. And now, of course, it's not like they're going to the supermarket of ideology and picking things out. It comes from years of socialization, but they have adopted a set of beliefs that you can't tell them they have, right? They have to say they have to own those. And I think this gets very interesting about the dynamic quality of beliefs and our ability to really accurately infer what other people's beliefs are, which I think is important to understand. It's a really different kind of identity, this adopted identity. And I think that's true, Sherry, that a lot of other aspects of fault lines are these more invisible things that people choose to keep as part of their identity or not. So those are two things.
Yeah, that's tough to follow on. You covered a lot of ground that certainly resonated with me. I think I just wanted to kind of underscore, well, so like Sherry mentioned some of the sort of tools and mechanisms we might have in organizations that may very well increase polarization or decrease polarization. And I feel like, to Audrey's point, some of that is I think, there's a certain set of research that suggests just throwing people together into the task before you get into like what are your underlying values, what are your underlying beliefs, can actually help them sort of transcend all those more like the deeper level diversity. And I think there's a lot of merit in that, where folks, maybe it's a sense of common fate, or maybe there's a clarity to the shared work goal versus more abstractness and lack of clarity when it comes to like the underlying beliefs. But I do think there's something there when you just throw people together and say, you need to get this done. And you know, they get it done somehow. Again, not all the time, but it's very interesting that we are able to pull that off. And then that can give them perhaps a sense of you know, shared experience, shared trial that they can bond over, that sort of transcends the differences in beliefs. But with the talk of beliefs and identity, I think what I would add is the role of affect. And by affect, I mean anything, this is my understanding of the term affect, you know, it's anything that has some sort of valence to it. So yes, it includes emotions and moods, but also from my work on a felt sense of the whole group, a felt sense of either, you know, belongingness and wholeness or fragmentation. That's really important. And I think we've seen from a couple of vantage points, I'll just mention two, you know, Gallup organization and its global employee polling. You know, people have touted for a while now the, you know, 33% of the global workforce feels disengaged, right? Psychologically disconnected from their work. But from what I can see, those statistics hold true since 2013, so pre-pandemic, right? So the world of work, there's been a lot of sense of disconnectedness and loss of meaning with the system that I'm contributing to via my work. And then, of course, you have not just the US political environment, but across the globe, um, including my tiny home country, Trinidad and Tobago. We find that line and we split, right? There's this, I think the disaffectation is really important, that folks really want a sense of meaning, as I think as intrinsically human, through belongingness and a sense of being part of something greater than ourselves. And I think that felt dynamic is super important, you know, coinciding with the beliefs that are articulable or not, or the values, etc. So how folks key into that feeling, I think is really important, and may help drive a lot of what we're observing in and out of organizations.
I want to actually kind of switch for a moment and go to a couple of the audience questions. And I'm going to
Sure.
ask one of those annoying questions that's like 15 things embedded in one, but there's a couple of themes coming up. And one, I think this is an easier one, is can polarization be a characteristic of a person? Can I be polarized? Or is it merely a characteristic of groups? Is it a between, kind of in that interstitial space between kind of groups of people? And then if we think about that in organizations, which is a theme that's come up a lot and what many of you have said, how do we manage that? So can we talk about everything at work that's political or not? How do we draw the line? Does it seem inauthentic if we can talk about things that are political, but maybe we agree on or are different in some way, versus more extreme situations like war or things like that? And then kind of how do we just basically keep civil discourse in organizations and amongst people in general? Anybody can take it. This is a curveball, but I was just so intrigued by the audience conversation.
Cecily, if you're jumping in, please go.
I can. So, the first issue, can a person, so the way that the literature would say, the way that the literature would talk about an individual being polarized, if I'm polarized, it means that my views are extreme left or are extreme right. Okay. And they're not just strongly held, but you know, I'm very consistent in my voting patterns, and maybe I attend rallies and marches and things like that to support my views. That would imply that I myself am more polarized in terms of my individual views. The second question was about how can people talk about politics at work or have civil discourse? Some people do have a lot of civil discourse at work about politics with those who are like-minded, and people tend to choose to talk to people about politics if they trust that person and already have a good relationship with them and they know that they're similar or are like-minded. When you think about, well, what constitutes a political discussion, that's really interesting, because when you ask people that, it's extremely broad. It's not just, you know, who won the election. It can be anything almost these days. It can be your vegan status. It can be, gosh, what do people, your vegan status or a diversity initiative that's being discussed. It's so broad. And so, yeah, I'm not sure what else to say, but but how people think about political discourse is extremely broad these days. It's not just about talking about elections and politicians. And when people are similar or like-minded, they don't seem to have a problem talking about politics at work. That said, some people do feel that others are not professional if they talk about politics at work. So if somebody comes and starts talking to me about politics, it might concern me in terms of their professionalism. And I might be less likely to put them in an important meeting with a client or a customer or somebody like that, because I might think, well, they can't control themselves. It's almost like they have like low emotional regulation, but it's in terms of talking about politics. So if they're going to talk about politics to me and I don't feel that's professional, I might be less likely to put them with other important people because I'd be concerned about what they would say to those other people. And that's kind of interesting.
A way to get out of meetings, maybe.
Yeah.
I have a colleague like that, actually. I would jump in on that a little bit, that I actually do think this is, the policy helps. And when there are opportunities to have an appropriate conversation, discourse about something political, how to do that. So in terms of policy, and people do need to understand this, like if you work in a private, publicly traded firm, you do not have privacy rights over any media you use at the workplace. And you can be held accountable for speech that is damaging to the firm. So that's not a policy, that's basically what are employee rights and responsibilities. So that should, if people are very clear, they understand that, and firms are clear on how they're playing that out, it disambiguates a lot of what we should be talking and we shouldn't be talking about. And I think that's appropriate. I do. And firms need to stay ahead of the National Labor Relations Board on this. They went through a period where they're very pro worker, right? So reversing dismissals that were for speech that was outside of work, but somehow reflected on their job or on the company. But they were less likely to overturn those if they were actually directly criticizing the company. That's one where they side on the rights of the firm. I would expect now that the NRLB will be less pro-worker. And so it's important for firms to understand that and be clear with their employees about when and how they should be expressing their opinions, and recognizing again that there isn't this clear border between work and outside of work. So there's that part of policy that I think is important and helpful to kind of create guardrails on what are okay conversations. I'm very much affected by the article that Cecily gave me by Burmis and McDonald a couple of years ago, looking at two major cues that people use to kind of infer ideology. And one of them are basically side conversations. So you don't have to be talking about politics, you're just having a side conversation when something comes up. And the other are these strategic decisions, resource allocation decisions that reveal value priorities of the decision maker of the company. I think those in particular are a really good opportunity for civil discourse. I think those are times when it is appropriate and actually productive to talk about the values behind the allocations. In my current role, I allocate incentives to faculty, and we have a debate about sort of communitarian values and free agency values, which really are two very different values about what you should be doing as an academic. And that that actually leads to deeper conversations among like the department chairs, which I think are very good. And it's really, why are we here? What is the true mission of our organization? And so we can have diverse opinions about, you know, are you a socialist academic, you know, or are you, just out for number one, and you wouldn't, you charge people for a bucket of water to, you know, put out the fire. So they can still hold those beliefs, but I think these conversations help people get to common ground. And so I think there's a really important place for having civil discourse. So the other side of that, I think, is training people. For years ago, I did research on active listening and training people to be active listeners, and pretty simple techniques, really useful. So I think training people, and it's not about talking about politics at all, it's just like, because they should be using it when they're giving performance feedback. They should be using it when they're negotiating. There's so many applications of it that to, you know, upping our training to make people collaborate more effectively in the workplace, I think would be a great way to foster more civil discourse without like directly saying, let's talk about politics, let's not talk about politics.
I want to jump in because our next question that we were kind of given was about what would you like to see more of in future polarization research? And for me, actually, this conversation is really speaking to that, which is like, what are the trigger or tipping points that move kind of groups or organizations to a place where they become more polarized? And the flip side of that is, how can we have these kinds of conversations without them becoming those tipping points, right? Because if we're respectful of others' views and we're able to have these conversations, and maybe it started from speaking about other issues, then it doesn't feel like it's a conversation about politics. It just happens that some political views get discussed as we're actually talking about, say, resource allocation or something else. And so maybe that takes away some of the effective emotional components that seem to undergird so many of the political views. And so figuring out the ways that organizations or managers can do that, I think, would be a super future and, you know, ongoing and future research areas.
And it's a super easy task, right? For any managers.
Of course, absolutely.
Well, I think that's tied to Audrey's point about training, and that's where I come in. So, you know, as Sherry said, you know, how can managers kind of create that space and hold that space? I think we need practice. I think it's, if we sort of accept that it's a pretty basic human imperative to shift, right, by social identity. But it's also intrinsically human, I think, to come together. Like, we have that capacity, but we need, you know, we get very distracted. So I think having the training, really just the practice, you know, I think of Emma Levine's work about difficult conversations. And if I recall correctly, I think her research shows that most people don't realize that the other party, so you're looking at individuals, actually wanted to have the difficult conversation. We just assume folks don't want to have the conflict, quote unquote. So I think sort of what are our working assumptions and presumptions? But then you still have to skill people to hold that space. So whether it's active listening or relational listening, constructive communication, how do you hold that space for potentially conflicting thoughts and feelings? Is a lot of, you know, it takes a great deal of skill and your own emotional regulation and differentiation. But I think we have the capacity for it. And so if organizations can invest in it, and as Audrey said, it's not just about politics, it's about all sorts of conversations and topics in organizations. So I see that as something that we can all contribute to in whatever social spaces we're in.
So thanks to Sherry for helping kind of get us back to the research, which I'm really curious about. And you talked a little bit about it, but if you want to add some more thoughts about, where would you like polarization research to go? How do you wish it were studied? What's the coolest thing that it could do in the future? What do you think? What are your recommendations? Or what's next for you?
I can jump in if Sherry's thinking about more stuff.
Oh, I thought I was going to pass on to
Is it-
Cecily.
Oh no,
Okay.
sure. I mean, I would
Uh,
jump in real quick and say I think it was Cecily, you brought up the societal polarization entering organizations. I'm very curious about the reverse. I'm very curious about polarization within organizations, whether maybe it's some sort of decision-making pattern or practice, um, or some strategic macro level set of processes that then filter out, because organizations are um, the most powerful stakeholders in most societies these days. I'm very curious about both the reverse and then also the interaction, right? Do they how society and organization sort of mutually reinforcing or transmuting the polarization or lack thereof that we see.
hmm.
Yeah, I'm hoping to see more of that in our upcoming special topic forum at AMR, because we really want people to think broadly about the
Yeah.
issue of polarization. So hopefully we'll get some very interesting stuff.
Yeah, yeah. And so, yeah, there's what you're saying, JP, is these questions about kind of across levels. How does polarization, yeah, and Audrey and I have discussed that quite a bit. It's incredibly complicated to think about because we've been starting like societal, then organizational, and then you can have work teams that have a certain ideology, and you can have individuals within those work teams. And yeah, so, and the work team could have a different ideology than the overarching organization, or most organizations are neutral in terms of their ideology, but then you could have different teams or departments within the organization that lean right or lean left and have contrasting ideologies within that organization. So yeah, those are all very different kind of contexts. I was going to answer the question to say, in terms of what I'd like to see and thinking about research on ideological polarization, the strategy literature, the macro literature is way ahead of the micro literature in studying this topic. And, I've read all the strategy literature with great interest, and Don Hambrick in particular has some really great articles on organizational political ideology. And I would like to see more micro scholars getting in this space. And I think there are now. And then secondly, of the micro studies that are published, a lot of them use experimental methods. I'm thinking about Phil Roth's work and some others. And I think that's great because that helps establish internal validity, of course. But I think, but that really generalizes to new or arm's length relationships. And Audrey and I have been discussing how we think the impact of ideological differences can be much more complex in established relationships. So I'd like to see more research studying established relationships, and all of my studies that I discussed, the 4 that I'm working on, all study established relationships and how ideological differences and similarities affect those.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
So when I was doing my comprehensive exams back in 1985, Susan Jackson was one of my professors, and the question was, I was an industrial organizational psychologist, kind of like OB, right? So what does your field contribute to the field of psychology? Like, how do you pay back? Like, what have we developed that other people are using in other areas of psychology? Boy, that's sticking my craw. I think this is one of those areas around this issue of existing relationships and how shifting identities impact those relationships is a way we can be making a contribution to more fundamental research on identity. Because again, that is like a big explanatory theory for research on political and ideological polarization. But by bringing it into the workplace, where there are other identities that are operating, and assumptions about shared identities that we belong to the same group. And there's also a lot more, you can think about identities as being group, relational, or individual. There's a lot more relational and individual identities. And so how does this particular factor cause some of that, that jumping around, and how does it change what people see? It's not just like, what is the group? It's not what group do I belong to, but what is this group? Because it kind of alters the content of the identity. Related to that, I think, particularly again with political or ideological identities, that they're very dynamic, both in terms of what externally is considered that identity. What does it mean to be a conservative? And also internally. You know, I'm a liberal, and I really didn't think about what I ate. Now I think about what I eat, right? And Cecily was talking about being vegan or something. So, you know, like, so I think that the movement of, say, the vaccine controversy has really moved to the forefront, and it has fallen into one bin, which I think is really interesting. I think, you know, 15 years ago, not so much. Right, so there's this dynamic content to these attitudes that I think is really useful to look at, and people change their minds on these issues, and I think that's very interesting. So, there's something about the workplace that allows us to see that in ways that you don't necessarily see in other social arenas, particularly with regard to this issue of having existing relationships that have a certain domain to them, and this breaks down a lot of that. Makes it really interesting. So I'd like to see more work on the dynamics of identity, political identities, or, you know, assumed identities.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in and add to what Audrey said. Yeah, I think as organizational scholars, we have great opportunities here, because outside of work, if you interact with somebody you don't match up with, you don't have to continue that interaction. But if we work together, chances are, you know, you're going to have to continue collaborating with that person. And are you going to do so? You know, are you going to try to kind of maintain a positive relationship while you do that? Or are you going to try to keep it arm's length, even though you're collaborating? But we're forced to keep interacting with people who are different than us ideologically. So that gives us as organizational scholars an opportunity to like really dig into how people manage these differences.
And I'd also like to say, kind of in line with all of that, is organizations have leaders and managers at different levels. And given the power difference between, you know, employees and the managers and leaders, what role does that leadership play in terms of both creating an environment in which you can have those conversations or not? Or if the leader, him or herself, is very, you know, open about their views about things, how does that cause dissent or cause people to not speak up about their views? And so I think that we also need to really think about, because they have so much power in this space of polarization in organizations, that we really need to know more about what that looks like.
Well, I wish we had all day, because honestly, I think you have collectively made it such that polarization is relevant for the entire field of organizational behavior. So well done. I mean, we talked about emotions and perceptions and organizational structures and leaders and understanding identity and groups and things. So my mind is on too on fire for a Tuesday morning still here on the West Coast. But I do want to take time. We had a few more questions. I really wish maybe we'll have to do a part 2 sometime. But I want to give you time, if you would take just a minute or two, and this is your time, something you really want us to take away. If you just want to tell us a bad joke about polarization, or whatever, the space is yours. I really want to give you that space to kind of wrap us up, and then I'll close us off briefly in just a few minutes. So if we could start with Audrey on this one.
I feel the same way that you did, Laura, that this has been mind expanding to talk about this, and there's more perspectives than you all have discussed and opened my eyes to. So it's a huge opportunity for advancing our understanding, not only of polarization, but of our extant theories and phenomena, you know, like silence, minority dissent. I think there's so much out there that we could be looking at. It's overwhelming. I'm getting up there in years, so this is my gift to you No, I would say the opportunities are huge, and in terms of insight, and the second thing, I guess, is not so much a takeaway, but again, capitalism can save democracy. I do think the other aspect of the way we do research is it's applied. We are supposed to be relevant in our research, and that's not always the case in more basic sociology or political science. And so what we're doing is helping find solutions to difficult problems that are translatable into other realms of life. So good job.
Cecily?
Yeah, and I guess, one thing that stands out to me when I'm, analyzing my interviews or, looking at some of my other study data is that it's hard to keep yourself out of this dynamic. It's hard to remove yourself from the dynamic because even if I say, you know what, I'm going to conceal my ideology from others because I don't want them to make judgments of me based on my ideology. It doesn't matter because of societal polarization is basically priming most, if not all of us, to try to figure out what team each other plays on, right? And so we're at work and we make assumptions of others' ideology based on all sorts of stuff, like how they allocated bonus money. Are they a vegan? I heard that they went hunting. She volunteers at her church on the weekends. And all of these activities, which are arguably ideologically neutral, people attach an ideology to them and they're going to put you in a category. And so that's just something that we all need to realize. But then knowing that, we also need to realize that when we're making these assumptions about others, number one, they may not be accurate. And number two, if we're making downstream judgments of that person and how well they'll work with us based on their category, we probably shouldn't also jump to those assumptions either.
I guess my takeaway, like all of you, just there's a lot of things to think about now. My mind's swirling a little bit with all of it, but I would love to be. I mean, what Cecily has said, I think is true, and I like, oh yeah, I can see myself doing that. But I also feel like there's a way to if you can stop yourself from doing that in some way, right, and say, yes, they go to church and that might mean this, but they're also a really good worker, right? So that, and also, which ties into other identities. So how can we have a more composite understanding of individuals and how they want to be viewed and seen, as opposed to always trying to put them in categories? So I don't know the answer, like what does it take to stop this? But that would be something I would love to see us look at.
Marilyn Brewer has done research on identity complexity, which I think is related to that. The other thing is early research in performance appraisals. They did a lot of research on central trait theory, which is like one marker that spreads over to a lot of other stuff, and how to overcome central trait errors. I think that's kind of the same kind of cognitive phenomenon you're talking about.
Yeah, I think it's become much more complex though, right? Because we have this coming at us all the time now, and so it's become just a natural worldview, but we need to somehow step back, because I suspect, at least in the political view, there's probably a lot more people in the middle than we talk about. And so what about them? And so kind of figuring out how we can include them in this conversation as well. Okay, JP, on to you.
1 minute left. Sure. I love everything everybody said. I'll pick up Sherry's baton and say, where is the hope, right? So can we invest, to Audrey's point about application and understanding interventions, right? Like again, I'll say we have the human capacity for care and kinship is not dead. I don't believe that. But how do we work through all the triggers and cues, like Sherry pointed out? They're constantly around us. They're cueing reactions, like Cecily pointed out. How do we intervene into that in ways that resonate with people? I think there's a lot of evidence out there about the greater commonalities that we have and differences. But so how do we break down, even when people receive those data, though, they don't buy into it. So how do we intervene into that? I would love to see more research on that, but also more kind of practical engagement informed by our research in our universities, in our schools, and in our communities.
That is such a perfect way to end, and I love that. Where is the hope? I think that's the hashtag for today. I think there is always hope. So on behalf of the Conflict Management Division and IUCN, we thank our panelists, JP and Cecily and Sherry and Audrey. For Pri and I, we have learned so much. We really are so grateful. Don't be surprised if we follow up for part 2 at some point. And please consider, for all of our audience members, thanks for sticking with us. Join the Conflict Management Division at Academy of Management if you're not already a member, because as you can see, we're a pretty cool group of people, and we would love to have you. So thanks again, and everyone have a great rest of your week.